I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're about to hear a chapter of my ongoing sword and sorcery serial. Every week, without fail, I write a brand new chapter and then I record it in one single, flawless take. It picks up right where we left off last time, so if this is your first episode and you want to know everything that's going on, you might want to start back at the beginning. But if you'd rather dive in here and figure it out as you go, that's totally fine too. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 30. It was a beautiful sound. The sound of pristine, flawless, Elven steel, reverberating in the sun-filled air. Thin, but unbelievably strong, the metal vibrated and rang out like the string of a harp, filling all those who heard it with breathless anticipation. It was fitted perfectly to its scabbard, brushing lightly against that stiff leather, pressed with ancient elvish glyphs telling tales of valor and conquest. The scabbard had set the steel singing, and now she wielded it proudly, swinging it to and fro, allowing the note to swell and fill her throne room with song. The duelsmiths knelt before her, anxiously awaiting her assessment, her judgment of their work. A dwarf and an elf, both highly skilled in the near-forgotten techniques of their people. They had worked together to create something new, something beautiful, something deadly, at their queen's command. The dwarf spoke first. His gruff, toneless speech and rough, common appearance, a laughable counterpoint to the splendiferous tune that surrounded him. My queen, is our work, is it to your liking? Enlith lowered her brows, scowling at her reflection in the flawless steel. Too many worries. Too many cares, and now too many lines on a too young face. Yes, it's perfect. Upon hearing her words, the duelsmiths breathed simultaneous sighs, overcome with relief. But before they could rise, before they could bask in their success, their queen spoke again. It's missing only one thing. The dwarf looked at the elf, furious, desperate for someone to blame, and the elf looked at his feet, clenching his eyes shut. Though the sword was apparently lacking, he knew that it was more than sharp enough to slice through his slender neck. It's missing that brute's blood. Enlith shoved the sword back into its scabbard, ending its song unceremoniously before turning back to her throne. She gave her thanks over her shoulder, and though not the triumphant celebration of their labors that they had expected, the duelsmiths recognized that it was far better than the alternative. They scurried from the throne room, eager to begin fulfilling the flood of orders from those wealthy enough to afford armaments, crafted by the queen's duelsmiths. Enlith sat gently down upon her throne, her back straight as an arrow, perched on the edge of her seat, sword across her knees, ready for action, desperate for it. She spoke to no one in particular, as she knew that her courtiers, her advisors, eager to please her, would find the answers that she required. What of the war priests? Has there been any word? A courtier, young enough for his ambition to outstrip his fear, stepped forward and boldly answered, "No, my queen, we have heard nothing from the war priests themselves, nor from the regiment dispatched to." "Then why are you still speaking? Are you so ineffectual that you must use 20 words where one will do? So desperate for attention?" Enlith sneered and gestured dismissively at the sputtering courtier. "Well, now you have received it. Someone get this simpering fool out of my sight." As the young courtier was escorted away, tears welling up in his eyes, mourning his once promising career, Enlith turned to an older advisor. Youth and its ambitions have their time and their place, but this was neither. She needed obedience and expedience above all else. "You have a regiment prepared, heavily armed and even more heavily armored." "Yes, my queen, of course. Do you have a preference who will lead this regiment?" "Yes, I shall lead it myself." The advisor took a moment to choose his path carefully before continuing on in as gentle a voice as he could muster. "Yes, my queen, of course. But surely your majesty has better things to occupy your time than—" Enlith was harsh, but she wasn't cruel. She knew that the advisor's blathering, unlike that of the courtier, wasn't meant to exalt himself, but rather to aid her. She appreciated his assistance, even though she did not accept it. "No, I do not. And even if I did, the war priests have proven themselves incapable of obeying my commands." Enlith allowed herself to relax somewhat in the throne, secure in a decision made and committed to. "And now I will do what must be done. I will need 2 parties of war priests, one to transport us to the border realm, as close as we can get to the Feldron's last known location. A thing like that, it shouldn't be difficult to track." "Yes, my queen. And the second party?" "The second party shall accompany my regiment. They will assist me in the capture and execution of the assassin Maul, and then they will dispel the Feldron." It was difficult for her to even say the word, and it became harder over time as she knew with greater and greater certainty the magnitude of horror that she had unleashed upon that border realm. "My queen, after seizing the assassin, perhaps a safer course of action would be to allow that thing to simply remain in the border realm." Enlith shook her head sadly. "No, that won't do at all. The terror, the death and destruction meted out by the Feldron. Collateral damage that I can live with. But I will not condemn an entire world to such a wretched end." She forced herself to say the word again, refusing to shy away from the grim choices that she had made, the choices she had to make. "The Feldron, if given an opportunity, it will destroy everything. Its corruption will seep into the earth and blast the landscape. Once it's served its purpose, it must be put down." "Of course, my queen." As his peers looked on nervously, the advisor spoke up once again. "Only one matter still requires your attention, my queen." The advisor swallowed hard. What of the war priests' families? Their wives, their children? They remain under heavy guard. Enlith pinched the bridge of her nose, sighing. "Do what must be done. But take the children to the orphanage." Once again, she stood panting in her tower, looking out over the blasted tundra as her enemies rushed and fought back to their caves. Her right arm ached, still sore from the fire, from the hungry, licking flame, the only thing capable of rooting out the disease, the corruption that would make her no better than those she fought against, those she would fight until there was no breath left in her. The trolls. She had successfully kept them away from the tower, from her tower, but it had been close, far too close. With her arms sore to the touch and stiff from the new skin growing to replace that she had burned away, her motions were severely limited, which in turn limited the effectiveness of her sorcery, the burning, all-consuming flame that she cast down upon the trolls. She had been lucky. The trolls weren't as aggressive as they could be, didn't press their advantage, and they certainly didn't make a plan or organize their assault. The ferocity and tenacity of their attacks varied wildly, but based on what? She had no idea. During the countless nights she had spent repelling the trolls, she had toyed with innumerable theories. Something in the wind? Perhaps it was as simple as exhaustion. Different groups of trolls on different nights. Phases of the moon? She chuckled at the absurdity of it. After all, her world's sun was always dim, and its moon was always full. She spared a brief glance at her arm as the sun climbed speedily up into the sky, eager to complete its daily journey and retreat once again beyond the horizon. The skin was raw, covered in blisters that burst, oozed, and refilled themselves with pus as she watched. But still, as red and angry as her wound was, there was no green in it. And for that, she was thankful. She gingerly lowered her sleeve down over the wound and was about ready to collapse into bed when she saw it. Out in the distance, sitting upon the horizon, moving slowly but steadily before her. It wasn't the frantic, unorganized retreat of the trolls, but a steady, purposeful march. There was intelligence in their motions. And suddenly, there was hope in her heart. She seized a spyglass from a nearby table, then quickly returned to the window, already in the process of adjusting the device's complicated lenses, the ones she worked blindly, feeling her way with simple trial and error. When the picture came into focus, she nearly dropped the spyglass out the window, shocked to her core by what she saw. They were people, not trolls, not the half-turned abominations that she used to see years ago when her tower wasn't the only holdout, but actually real-life people. Men and women marching proudly, grimly across the landscape, armed to the teeth with swords, with spears, with chains. And most importantly, with fire. And not just any fire. No, this was the true flame, the all-consuming blaze that she herself commanded, the fire capable of turning back those green-skinned monstrosities. She scanned the group person by person, examining each of the party's dozen members until she found him. Kindred spirit, one with whom she could have a hope, a chance at salvation, at drenching the world with liquid flame, at cleansing their realm with beautiful, breathtaking fire. She began to shake with uncontrollable joy when she laid her eyes upon him. A fellow sorcerer. To her amazement, the sorcerer and his party, those brave, vicious men and women, they were doing exactly that which she had dreamt about. They marched through the landscape, making steady but slow progress that was only slow because of the frequency with which they stopped, taking up positions around those darkened caves, the ones that spewed out heaving green flesh night after interminable 20-hour night. Then, as the warriors stood, weapons at the ready, the sorcerer summoned up the flame from the ether, then funneled it down into the caves before stepping back and allowing his companions to strike down those trolls who weren't immolated in that initial blast. Again and again, they repeated the pattern. She watched with joy as the sorcerer cast flame into those dark tunnels, balls of fire that exploded so abruptly that they caused flashes of light across the landscape as the hungry, ravenous flame ripped through the trolls' labyrinthine caves. As thrilled as she was to see her kind on the offensive, to see the trolls learn the fear, the inexhaustible terror of the inevitable, worry and concern began to take seed within her. Yes, it was all fine and good now, but how could they be sure not to suffer the fate that almost took her? By wielding such destruction, by marching so assuredly through the landscape, how could they combat the corruption that had taken root when she merely dreamt of such a crusade? But as she watched, she noticed something curious. The party didn't only stop to fill the trolls' burrows with flame. Their pattern possessed an additional wrinkle. Every time the sorcerer set the trolls alight, every time his companions struck down the flaming monsters that emerged, screaming from their holes, every time they cleaned their blades and refreshed themselves from the canteens at their belts, the sorcerer checked them. He inspected all of their limbs, the places where the corruption always set in first, and if he found something, he reached out to the ether and called forth that hungry flame once again, this time turning it on his companions, who clenched their teeth, dug their nails into their palms, and allowed themselves to be cleansed. Then, and most crucially, the sorcerer's companions turned their sharp warrior eyes on the spellcaster himself, searching carefully for even a hint of green on his skin. Despite her exhaustion, she felt invigorated, refreshed, as if she could have stood and watched the war party's progress for the entire day. But as she was all too keenly aware, that day, that meager 4-hour day, would be horribly insufficient, nowhere near long enough for the party to make it to the safety of the tower. So, with a rare smile on her lips, she lowered herself into bed. She knew that at their current pace, the sorcerer and his companions would need at least 1, possibly 2 additional days to reach her. And during that time, they would need her help. The stone god roared, but not with the booming burst of flame that Maul had heard it utter before. It roared with the voice of a man, of a harried soul who had been imprisoned in a shattered, ruined mindscape. Maul heard the voice of the dream mage, of Traum, who after a lifetime in exile had now returned to the physical world. "You fool! You fool!" Traum, trapped in the body of the stone god, stared at his hands, clenching his granite fists, looking on in panic-stricken horror as gravel and dust fell to the ground, as his motions cracked the stone into jagged, ugly joints. "What new prison have you trapped me in? What fresh hell have you condemned me to? Do you have any idea what you have done?" Maul started to laugh, but before he could speak, something crashed into Traum. Something massive, otherworldly, and foul. Something that's very present spat in the face of all that was decent, spat in the face of nature itself. Traum stumbled and regained his footing as he turned to face the Feldron, which quivered in response, its slavering jaws repeating the endless refrain. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." Traum was not pleased with his new body. Not only was it massive, unwieldy, and likely to continue crumbling under further use, but he could already tell that the procedure hadn't been followed. And how could it have been? How could Maul, that ignorant savage, know the proper way to usher a mind into a new body? How could that beast perform a task that it took Dream Masters decades to learn and perfect? He couldn't. He had taken the easy way out, and now Traum would be the one to suffer for it. But if Traum was to be trapped inside that body, he would make the most of it. He would use what remained of his life, and he would use it well. And that meant that first and foremost, he would seize that traitorous brute and rip him limb from limb, tearing his arms and legs off piece by piece, pulling slowly enough to prolong his ecstatic revenge for as long as physically possible, allowing Maul's agonized screams to echo in his stone ears, a comforting noise that he would carry with him into eternity, into the inky black void of nothingness that beckoned to him. But Traum wasn't the only one with the self-proclaimed king of men in his sights. Traum struggled with his mind, seemingly now made of the same heavy, inelegant granite as the rest of his body. That thing, the undulating horror, the one oozing around Traum in an effort to reach Maul, and all the while mumbling to itself in its horrible, scratchy, pained voice. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." Traum had seen it before. No, not seen, but felt. He recognized that foul perversion, though he couldn't put a name to neither the beast itself nor where he had encountered it in the past. Somewhere in the dream realm? It must have been, for it was where he had spent the majority of his life. He knew that he knew the creature, but he just didn't know. None of it made any sense, and his brain ached from simply thinking about it. Nothing made sense, and Traum couldn't tell whether it was on account of his advanced mental age, a side effect of the quickly moving dream time and the eternity he had spent there, or a sign that his mind, ravaged by its artless transfer into the stone body, was already beginning to unravel. But there was one thing that Traum did know, and he knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. If that thing, whatever it was, if it heaved itself upon Maul, if it wrapped those unnatural tendrils around him, then Traum, the one with more reason to hate Maul than anyone, then he would never get to taste his revenge. He would go to his grave without hearing the sweet sound of Maul's agonized cries, without hearing the savage's hopeless death rattle. And that was unacceptable. So Traum, looming over that odious heap, reached down and seized the Feldrun, roaring in frustration, in agony, in rage. But every time he took hold of the Feldrun's limbs, those thick, viscous, ever-shifting membranes, another would reach out from the monster's sinister form, either extending toward Maul, gripping the ground for leverage, or even wrapping itself around its new rival, and all the while apologizing in a voice that was anything but contrite. "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." It was no use. Even with his new stone body, the cyclopean form that he now commanded, it was no use. Traum couldn't hold back the Feldrun, that wild, flowing mass that was simultaneously formless and possessing of a shape that caused the Dream Warrior's mind to reel in confusion, terror, and shame. Traum couldn't overpower the monster by physical means, but he still had one last tactic available to him. Placing his hand on what was, by his best guess, the Feldrun's head, he tapped gently and spoke in a voice that was as gentle as his stone throat could muster. "Sleep." Traum dove inside the Feldrun's mind, still not knowing or understanding what it was that he faced. He was desperate, frantic, eager to be done with the monster so that he might turn his violent intentions upon a more deserving recipient. Maul. So, when he arrived in the Feldrun's mind, he was ill-prepared for what he found. The Feldrun didn't have a vendetta against Traum, the stone god he inhabited, or the halflings of Cliffholm. He didn't hate any of them, not specifically at least. As best Traum could tell, the Feldrun didn't even hate Maul, the self-proclaimed king of men, the assassin he had been not just dispatched, but created, bred, summoned out of the plains beyond to hunt down and destroy. No. The Feldrun didn't hate Maul. It hated one thing and one thing only. Itself. But that hate, that loathing, that self-loathing was all-consuming. It poisoned the Feldrun's mind, planting a seed of hatred that infected its entire body, and given the opportunity, it crept out into the world around it. The Feldrun didn't hate anyone or anything. It only hated itself. But that hatred is what it used to define itself, to give itself meaning and purpose in the world. It was both cause and effect, a brutal, never-ending cycle of destruction, loathing, corruption, hatred, and misery, soul-crushing, mind-numbing misery. Traum found himself in a darkness that weighed heavily on him, a darkness that he could see devouring the light, a darkness that colored his mind and body as it had done to the Feldrun. He struggled to gain control of the monster's mindscape, but the more he fought, the more he was dragged down, and the more he understood of what the Feldrun wanted, what it needed, what it absolutely had to have. The Feldrun hated itself. It wanted nothing. No, it wanted nothingness. It wanted a return to the darkness. Its self-loathing was so strong that the only thing that could sate its desires was the inky black void of nothingness. It needed an end, a finish, an end to it all, but the only way that could come, that merciful end, was by completing its task, by destroying Maul, by doing what the elves wanted. It didn't hate Maul, it loved Maul. Maul was its freedom, Maul was its escape, Maul was its way out. But Maul wouldn't let him possess him. No one would let him possess them, even though it's the thing that he wanted the most. Why couldn't they understand? Why wouldn't they choose to understand? Why would they choose not to understand? The self-loathing didn't come from within. It came from without. It was forced upon him. He didn't choose it. It was never his choice. The loathing wasn't something he wanted. It was something he was given, cursed with, something laid upon his shoulders to suffer for eternity. What fault was it of his that it corrupted, that it destroyed, that it defiled? It wasn't. It was no fault of his. It was not. Where did this loathing even come from? It came from them, but still he knew. He knew what he had done, what he truly was, what he did even now. He knew, and he knew that of all the things he hated, of the people he abhorred, of the worlds he reviled, of all of it, he hated himself the most. Maul backed away from the battle as quietly as he could, his mind aching, freed from Traum's influence, yes, but still shattered, broken, and now corrupted by the touch of the Feldrun. He wanted to run, wanted to turn tail and put as much distance between himself and the Feldrun as possible, the undeniable emotion that overcame all those who laid eyes upon that vile creation. But he couldn't help it. He was mesmerized by the battle, the clash of those two monsters caught in one another's grip, howling in unison over and over again. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Maul kept staring, watching in fascinated horror as Traum, in his new stone body, fought that shifting, unnatural terror throughout the halfling village. They scratched, bit, and tore like wild animals, but despite their exertions, they never missed a single recitation of their agonized, painful, penitent refrain. And as they struggled, first one gaining advantage, then the other, everywhere they landed, the soil turned to blackened ash, corrupted with the overwhelming power of their loathing. When Xylan joined him, barely recovered from his encounter with the Feldrun, Maul was still staring in awe, with the massive cat beast Skog sitting loyally, patiently by his feet. The godless monk touched Maul's shoulder, breaking the spell and speaking quickly. Maul, we have to go. Maul shook his head, struggling to piece his mind back together. What? Where? Where can we even go? Anywhere but here. We need to get away from that thing. If we get to Ravena, we can... Maul cut him off, his voice flat and lifeless, overcome with the inevitable. There's no point. Without Traum, the Dream Masters will never help us. I might be able to help you with that. Xylan grinned as that same familiar, disconcerting laugh rose up in his throat. The Dream Masters aren't the only ones who can travel between the sundered worlds. Maul spared a glance back at the fight. The Feldren had taken control once again, and it drove Traum backward, back toward where they had first collided. And as they neared, their corruption spreading out ahead of them, Maul's harem, the halfling girls Suwana and Belbrix, began to belt out unintelligible, uninhibited shrieks of pure, wretched dismay. Wincing, trying and failing to ignore their cries, Maul turned back to Xylan. "You can get me to the realm of men?" Xylan grinned nervously. "Do you trust me?" Maul stole another moment and looked back. He didn't look at the monsters, one that he had led to Cliffhome and another that he had created. Nor did he look upon the dead and dying halfling villagers, warriors, hunters, cooks, witch doctors, men, women, and children, all broken, shattered, and ruined at his command. He didn't even look upon the corruption that spread out through the very earth itself. No, he looked back at his harem, at Suwana and Belbrix. They cried out to him, begging for mercy from their god king, pleading with their lover to come back, to free them, to take them with him, to allow them to live out their days in his service. And though the monsters were near, though the fight drew closer by the second, there was still time. He could run back, he could release the ropes, and maybe, just maybe... "Maul, do you trust me?" Xylan repeated himself, the panic cutting through his laughter. "No." Xylan cackled as a smile shot across his face. "Good. You're smarter than you look." With Xylan still laughing, they turned away from the carnage that Maul had brought down upon Cliffhome. And they ran. If you're digging SKALD, please leave a good review on iTunes. It helps other people find the podcast, and if you leave a good one, I'll read it on the show. My former dungeon master, Spencer Cross, says, "Epic. Really good stuff. Haven't found anything else like it." This is the 30th episode of SKALD. 30 weeks of bringing you the brutal, non-stop, serialized sword and sorcery action that you crave. All for completely free. Thing is, SKALD takes a lot of time I'm not spending on other paying projects. If you really like SKALD, if you want me to keep doing this thing forever, please go to patreon.com/SKALD. All I'm asking for is $1 a month, which is $0.25 per episode. You are not getting a better entertainment value than that anywhere. If you enjoy SKALD, I'd love to hear about it on social media. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Username Aubrey Sitterson. Super easy. Or, just as easy, hit up aubreysitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, the SKALD ebook, still just $2.99 on Amazon, my comics writing, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. Ready for another reco? I'm working ahead, so by the time you hear this, it will already have been out for a few weeks. But let me tell you, Graveyard's new album, Innocence and Decadence, will still be awesome. They're a Swedish group that do an amazing style of doom metal that picks up on and expands the bluesier parts of doom metal godfathers Black Sabbath. It's metal for people who don't like metal. Also, for people who do like metal. It's great, and so are their other albums. Check them out. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.